Well, welcome to everyone who is joining us in this virtual setting. We're so glad that you have found your way to this particular video. My name is Alison Cornish, and I serve as the Climate Chaplaincy Initiative Coordinator at the BTS Center in Portland, Maine. We're so delighted to be able to do this production and have it up on our website for everybody to have a chance to look at and to engage with. The BTS Center is the successor organization to the Bangor Theological Seminary. And our organization has as its tagline, spiritual leadership for a climate changed world. And that's exactly what we do. We provide programs, experiences, resources, opportunities for all people in different roles to spend time understanding more deeply our climate crisis, our climate changed world, and their vocational call to be of service in this time in so many different ways. What we are learning in the course of this work is that all of us are subject to the damage of a climate changed world, not just the literal damage to our water, our air, our land, but also to our spirits. We at the BTS Center understand the climate crisis as a spiritual crisis. And that's one reason that we have been so intrigued with the research connecting moral injury to climate change. We are so grateful to be able to engage with others who have been thinking deeply about these issues. And one of those people is Liz Farmer. Liz is an ordained chaplain and lay teacher of Zen Buddhism under the guidance of Roshi Joan Halifax. She served as a chaplain and meditation teacher in healthcare and education and carceral settings. She most recently worked with Spiritual Care Services of Maine, providing telehealth chaplaincy, as well as mobile outreach to people experiencing homelessness in Portland, Maine. Liz additionally co-leads a spiritual community in Southern Maine dedicated to the intersection of social justice and Buddhist teachings, and serves as a mentor for students in the Upaya Zen Center's chaplaincy training program. During her own chaplaincy training, Liz wrote a master's level thesis on spiritual care for veterans experiencing moral injury, and now has since taught on moral suffering and moral resilience in a variety of settings, including with and for us at the BTS Center. Liz, we are so grateful to have your wisdom as part of this program.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'm so grateful to be invited into this conversation. And as you shared, I'm both a graduate of UPIA's chaplaincy program and currently work in the chaplaincy program. And that's where I had the good fortune to learn about moral suffering in its various forms. And I've been so intrigued over these last couple of years in conversation with you all at the BTS Center, um, reflecting on how to apply this in the context of climate change. And so I just feel really lucky to be part of this conversation. And as you know, and we have laughed about, I am not an ethicist by training. I'm not a climate expert. I'm a chaplain, and just really hope that some of what I've learned in my chaplaincy service and in my own reflection on moral suffering and moral resilience can be supportive, perhaps, to others, and especially to faith leaders and those who are working with kind of on the front lines of climate change. Because as you noted, this is something that we're all grappling with, the impacts of climate change in a broad sense, but also very specifically in our spiritual lives. And so that's my hope, is that this conversation can be of benefit in that way.
It is, I'm absolutely certain that it will be, both to me and to those who are watching this recording. So with that, let's jump in, and I know we'll have more conversation along the way.
Okay, I'm going to share some slides. Hopefully, give me one moment. Okay, I think we've got it. Are you seeing those okay?
I am. That looks great.
Okay, great. Okay, so one thing I do just want to expand on a tiny bit that I forgot to say when I was mentioning Upaya is just how much what I'm presenting is really rooted in the teachings of two people in particular who are associated with Upaya, and that is Roshi Joan Halifax, who you mentioned, and also Cinda Rushton. Um, Joan Halifax is a Buddhist teacher, the founder of Upaya. She's also a social activist. She's many, many other things, and a huge mentor in my life. And her colleague, Cinda Rushton, was a nurse practitioner for many decades and then became a researcher and is now a professor at Johns Hopkins University in clinical ethics. And so the two of them have done a lot of training in this area of moral suffering and moral resilience. They have trained many clinicians on these topics. They've written books about it. They've taught internationally. So really much of what I'm sharing is really their work, and I've tried to note that on the relevant slides as well. So just want to give credit where it's due as we get started.
Thank you. Yeah, our ancestors, they are
Yeah,
here with us. Yeah.
indeed. So to begin, one just underlying premise that it felt important to begin with is this notion that we're all moral beings, which of course doesn't necessarily mean we all share exactly the same values, but really just that most people have an innate sense of right and wrong, like a kind of internalized belief system that for most of us is shaped by our family of origin, also cultural influences, societal norms, those kinds of things. And I learned from Rita Brock, who we did a webinar with last February, about the work of Zachary Moon, who refers to this as a kind of moral orienting system that we all have, and
Mhm.
how it's often really operating in the background. And interestingly, it tends to come forth into our awareness at a more conscious level when we're faced with a situation that maybe challenges or disrupts this moral orienting system. And that's sometimes where moral suffering might arise. So we'll, of course, be talking a lot more about that. But I just wanted to begin with this premise that we all have a kind of moral compass, and therefore we all have the potential to experience some degree of moral suffering when our moral compass is challenged. So, on this next slide, this is jumping to the punchline, really, but many of us, I would argue, are experiencing moral suffering because of climate change. And that's because this moral compass that maybe we haven't been as aware of is bumping up against harm that is happening in an increasingly obvious way on a mass scale. So moral suffering in kind of an umbrella sense is defined here as the distress or anguish experienced in response to moral harms, wrongs, or failures. And we'll get into some different expressions of this and examples in a minute, but the key thing to understand broadly is that Moral suffering is really about these fundamental questions around integrity and
Mm.
what arises in our body and in also kind of a spiritual sense when that moral orienting system is compromised in some way.
Mhm.
Um, and so when we, as either individuals or as part of a group, cause suffering to ourselves or to other beings, our integrity is compromised, and that's when moral suffering tends to arise. And conversely, when we act to alleviate the suffering of others or ourselves, it can actually affirm our integrity and build moral resilience, which is what we'll be talking about in the second half of the presentation. So I just wanted to give that kind of overarching broad view as we go into the specifics of what this can look like in the finer grain. And also to say that moral suffering to some degree is inevitable because we live in a world where immoral things happen, unfortunately. And so the perspective that I'm hoping to offer here is not that moral suffering is necessarily something we're trying to get rid of entirely or eliminate. I think that would be quite unrealistic, but more about fostering an awareness of what it is, where it's likely to come up, especially for those of us who are chaplains or others who are serving in situations of suffering, and how we can respond to it so that we're not causing unnecessary harm to ourselves or others.
I'm so struck at how global this is as you're describing it, how this is a shared human experience. Um, Both the moral operating system, if we will, that we all have that orientation and that we all experience moral suffering. I'm really so grateful for you putting it out that this doesn't belong to one group or another, or that we can sort of educate ourselves away from this, but we can become more and more aware of the actual orienting systems that are within us and the ways in which they're in conflict and create suffering. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's so interesting that you say that, Allison, because whenever I talk about this with different groups and in different educational workshops I've been part of, even as a participant, the first reaction I often hear from people when they see this framing is they've sort of intuitively known that this has happened to them or that they've had this experience. They just haven't had a name for it. And
Mhm.
so I think this is one of the reasons I felt interested in this conversation with you, because I feel like the more we can share this kind of framing with people, the more it empowers people to realize there's something that we can do when that kind of suffering arises. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So getting into a little more fine grain detail here, and this is taken from Joan Halifax's work in Standing at the Edge, which is a book she wrote in 2018. She outlines these four forms of moral suffering, and I'll talk about each of them a little bit more: moral distress, moral injury, moral outrage, and moral apathy. And even though there are these four forms, I'll also say they can be overlapping. We might experience multiple types of moral suffering at once. It's not, all so neat. And the other piece that, excuse me, that feels important to add just to provide context here is that moral suffering and moral injury in particular was first studied in the context of war veterans. That's also my first exposure to it. It's more recently been researched in healthcare and in a few other fields. And as you acknowledged, we're still kind of early in applying this framework to climate change. And I think there are some unique aspects to climate change that are different than looking at this in the context of war or healthcare, which we'll get to later. But just wanted to also provide that context for where um, this thinking comes from. So, starting with moral distress, this occurs when we are aware of a moral problem and we determine a remedy, but are unable to act on it because of internal or external constraints. So I put this little cartoon here that just gives a really simple kind of everyday example. There's a man pumping gas, and while the immediate kind of monetary cost of the gas is cheap, as it says in the cartoon, underneath that it says climate change cost rising fast. So this is just one of those everyday examples that maybe many of us have experienced. I know, I, for example, have not given up my car, even though I know that emissions from cars are contributing to climate change. But I, like many people, I think, I live in an area where we don't really have the infrastructure that would make it easy to live without a car. And so when I go to fill up my car with gas, I may feel some moral distress that arises in that gap between my actions of using fossil fuels and um, ideally, kind of if I were unconstrained and more able to live in full alignment with my moral compass, the gap in between those two things. So, I'm sure we could think of many, many examples of this from daily choices about things like how we heat and cool our homes, what we choose to eat, the environmental impacts of that. We could go on and on about the moments in our day when we might recognize on some level that we're causing harm by our choices. And at the same time, I also want to note that uh, I think the media and certain other forces have created a tendency to overemphasize individual responsibility for climate change. And so, as opposed to the structural causes, the business and economic practices that are, um, I would argue, much more responsible for climate change. And so it's also true that when we begin to see that it's not all about our individual choices, we might begin to learn, oh, there are these systems that are also causing this kind of widespread harm. Moral distress can arise there as well, because it's not just about um, the my own actions that may be contributing to that twinge of I'm not quite in alignment with my values. It's also when I witness others who are out of alignment with my moral beliefs. So um, another source of moral distress for me might be the perception that the state or federal government hasn't really done much or done enough to support a shift to better public transportation, for example, or cleaner forms of energy. So there's the kind of a systems level moral failing, not just my own personal choice at the gas pump. So that's moral distress. I think, the way I've described it, and the way I experience it is it might happen in kind of a moment, a passing thought. We might feel some discomfort in the body. And one incidence of this is not necessarily an issue, but it's over time. I think these kinds of moments can almost begin to stack on each other in a way that can lead to more significant um, harm or ongoing distress. So does that feel clear?
It does and does. I really appreciate the bundle of distress that you just described, and how it can be experienced as an individual and how the collective impact of that can happen over a period of years, actually, that's really helpful. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, I think of it as rain. It's like, drip, 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 drip. And each individual drop is not necessarily a problem, but over time it can really be overwhelming. So, and And so then we get to moral injury, which is a more kind of severe version of moral suffering. And there are a number of definitions out there. I have two listed here. And the first one is from Jonathan Shea, who is actually the person who coined the term moral injury back in the, I think it was the early 90s. And he defined it as a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. And this was based on his work with Vietnam veterans. So you can imagine maybe some of the military implications here as well. And then Brett Litz, who was a researcher shortly after that, looking at moral injury, he defined it as perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. And what I really like about this second definition in particular is it makes it so clear that moral injury, again, it's not just linked to our own actions that perhaps violate our values, but it can even be, witnessing or learning about acts that violate our beliefs. And, um, you know, back to the context that this notion of moral injury was first understood and studied in the context of war, it makes sense, if you think about how in wartime we sanction certain kinds of actions in certain kinds of conflicts, I should say, such as killing, that in any other context would be universally perceived as morally wrong. Like every spiritual tradition would say that's not okay. But somehow we expect people in the military to be able to take lives and then somehow come home and go back to normal societal expectations. And for some of them, especially if the conflicts they were involved in were themselves morally ambiguous, there can be this lasting residue of moral injury when, say, a military person might eventually question whether their actions of violence were actually justified. So, and in contrast to moral distress, which is by definition milder, the symptoms of moral injury usually take more obvious forms, such as, um, first of all, strong feelings of shame and guilt is really a defining piece of moral injury. Often it can manifest as depression, as withdrawal. People often experience sleep disturbances, sometimes substance abuse issues, even suicidal ideation or suicidality. So it's, much more severe kinds of symptoms related to this. So getting back to moral injury in the context of climate change, and especially considering this definition that it can happen not just from our own actions, but also from witnessing actions. Returning to that example of fossil fuels again, I think about, climate scientists or really anyone who is in a daily way paying close attention to what's happening and repeatedly seeing there are these record-breaking profits from oil companies or climate summits. Like we just had the COP29, right, where various governments are making promises, but not quite enough to actually change the course of this trajectory, it seems. And so the data, keeps coming back with more and more dire indications of where we're headed. We keep breaking the global temperature records every single year, and there's this disconnect between what we know is morally right or kind of best action based on the science that we have, that it's really important to make changes and significant changes if we want to avoid these dire outcomes. And yet here are these companies and sometimes governments putting short-term profits or putting political gain over the risk to humanity in the long run. And the maybe the kind of most intense part of this, I think, is the fact that the people that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change are often those who have contributed least to the problem. And I don't know if you heard this, Allison, over the weekend, there was all of these finance negotiations happening at the UN Climate Summit, where the wealthier countries who've been, clearly more responsible for climate change were trying to figure out how much aid to give to developing countries. And after days of negotiation, the amount they came up with, to my understanding, was far less than what experts are saying is needed. And some of the people from these developing countries were understandably outraged and just, you could see the grief in their comments. And so it's like witnessing this moral failure and greed by people with economic and political power that's affecting millions, even billions of lives. So those people who are on the front row seats, I think, are the ones who are potentially the most susceptible to these more severe forms of moral injury. But even, uh, quote unquote, regular people who are paying close attention to this, it can be really demoralizing. And I use that word on purpose because I think it's such an interesting word. Demoralize, it's like stripping us of our morals, of our sense of integrity, that you know so much greed is happening at this mass scale.
Right. Right. That's such a good example of pulling in COP29. And I'm also thinking about this on a really individual level when there are conflicting moral claims on us as individuals. I'm thinking, for example, of somebody whose moral organizing system says feed the family and take care of the family. And yet the jobs that are available to that person are in extractive industries. They're that's got to set up a conflict in the individual. Which do I follow here? Um, and would certainly, I would think, set the conditions for significant moral injury.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a good point. And our experience of moral injury, I think, is also impacted by proximity to power. So, yeah, so there are these nuances, right, of um, kind of how much control we have over our immediate environment and these really difficult decisions that sometimes people have to make, like you're saying, just for survival or to feed their family, that might have kind of a contributive effect to the harm to the environment. But then looking at the larger system, um, weighing who is really responsible for the conditions that force individuals to make decisions that aren't really in anyone's best interest. So it's kind of all these layers of moral nuance there, I feel like. Okay to go on to moral out.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So yeah,
Mm,
the third form of moral suffering is moral outrage. And again, these are all kind of intertwined, but moral outrage defined as an externalized expression of indignation toward others who violate social norms. And it often involves anger. The emotion of disgust is often present with moral outrage, and often to a kind of powerlessness. Like this outrage comes from a place of feeling like there's no options. And I think of uh, Greta Thunberg, or really youth activists all over the world, but certainly Greta Thunberg has been one of the most visible faces of moral outrage, calling out the inaction of policymakers. And, we've seen her speak, we've seen worldwide climate protests with plenty of outrage on display. This is a photo that's taken from one of those climate protests that were led by youth a couple of years ago. And I want to note too, because I think sometimes anger gets a bad reputation, not least in Buddhist communities. um, that moral outrage can be healthy or unhealthy. Roshi Joan sometimes will teach about what she calls principled moral outrage, which is that um, that anger that actually energizes us to confront injustice or to intervene, to take action in an immoral situation. But the important thing about it is that it can be expressed or shared in a way that doesn't dehumanize whoever is perceived as transgressing the moral code. So
Mm.
it's like holding everyone's humanity in mind, in contrast to what I would describe as an unhealthy moral outrage that often, we see this all over the place online, sort of a moral superiority or a very blaming orientation as opposed to focusing on constructive action and something that sort of um, demonizes the people that are perceived as transgressing. So discernment, a kind of moral discernment, and the ability to be with these strong emotions is also very important in this conversation, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation as well.
A great point. Thank you for that amplification. So important.
So lastly, we have moral apathy, which is the fourth form of moral suffering. And uh, Joan Halifax defines this as when our denial, lack of caring, or willful ignorance make it possible for us to ignore or wall ourselves off from the suffering of others. And James Baldwin called it the death of the heart.
Mm.
Just such a powerful phrase. So sometimes moral apathy arises from, privilege, from maybe a denial, a sense of exceptionalism, like um, people who may acknowledge, oh, sure, the climate might be changing, but there's a sense it's not going to impact me, or I'm going to be okay. It's not something I need to think about. Um, so there's that kind of moral apathy of just choosing not to pay attention to this and feeling like somebody else will solve this problem. But also, and this is the part that I think is more nuanced as far as chaplains, activists, faith leaders, is that sometimes moral apathy can happen as a result of burnout when we really struggle to maintain the capacity to care because we've just, really gotten to the end of our rope, so to speak. And this can happen to faith leaders, it can happen in activist spaces when, especially I would say, when people have a perception that their actions aren't making a difference. Sadly, I've heard some people really speaking to this recently of just almost like, why should I keep doing this work if my efforts aren't having an impact? And uh, while that's a normal response in certain conditions, um, it can be, just incredibly, again, demoralizing, this sense of like, um, what are we here for? And fortunately, there are ways to work with that. And I think of that as a kind of reversible moral apathy that can be worked with in skillful ways. But I think that's something that probably many of us have seen in our faith communities and our activist communities as well.
And in ourselves.
And in ourselves, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's so important to name this part of moral injury, really, because I think that apathy gets there's so many connotations attached to it, many of them quite judgmental. And to bring it back to, well, wait a minute, this is something that's happening to our moral orienting system, um, rather than our inaction or our not caring or this is really helpful placement for this feeling, for this very real feeling.
Mm,
I'm really appreciating that.
absolutely. So, are we ready for a reflection pause?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We are going to encourage those of you watching this recording to pause at this point, pause the recording at this point, and have some journaling time for yourself to maybe even go back over these 4 different kinds of moral injury and suffering, and also, pulling your own experience in right now. Where do you see this showing up in your colleagues, in your clients, even in yourself, as well as in your community? And we are actually going to pause right here too with you, and we'll be back with you in just a moment. We hope that you've had a chance to pause and reflect for a little bit, and now we're going to resume with the second part of our recording now. Back over to Liz.
Okay. So, I just want to share a little bit about some of the impacts of unaddressed moral suffering. And again, to my knowledge, this isn't something that has been well studied so far in the context of climate change, but there is a lot of research in healthcare suggesting that moral suffering can lead to escalating rates of burnout and turnover, kind of a teamwork and trust erosion, anxiety, and a greater sense of despair and disconnection. And I think it's certainly likely, though it hasn't been studied in the same way, that similar dynamics may be present, maybe especially for folks working in climate science or in some way really um, facing the impacts of climate change on a regular basis. And importantly, I do want to highlight that this slide speaks to the consequences of unaddressed moral suffering. And so this is a really critical point in this whole conversation, that when we don't acknowledge or address the moral suffering, over time we may indeed see these sorts of negative impacts and kind of harm to self and harm to others. The hopeful piece, and this is what we'll spend the rest of our time on, is that when we can learn to recognize and be with and proactively respond to moral suffering, there is the potential to transform it and to actually strengthen our capacity to be leaders or scientists or whatever role we're in a more sustainable way, and in these fields where um, there is so much moral uh, adversity, I would say, this is going to be kind of an essential um, skill, in my opinion. And so that's where we're going next, is looking at moral resilience and how we can develop that. And I know, Alison, you have said this is something you're really seeing in the BTS centers constituencies as well. And I'm just curious to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, I'm so grateful for language that you're offering here, to put to what we're seeing. I mean, we are seeing in our in congregations that come to us, and chaplains who are in all kinds of settings, whether it's university or correctional or healthcare. Um, all of the things that you're listing in this slide: burnout, turnover, erosion of trust, anxiety, disconnection, and and despair. And I think many people come to the programs of the BTS Center because they have felt alone when these symptoms begin to arise in them, and recognizing that there's something underneath just the tiredness and the exhaustion and the relentlessness of work in spiritual care and in being ministers and pastors. I think that our programs have helped people put some language to this and say, ah, it is something very deep in me that is being violated. There's something very deep in me that is not being addressed
Yeah.
appropriately and compassionately. And it's something that they didn't teach us in seminary
Mhm.
necessarily. And without some community to hold me in this discernment process, I'm going to continue to feel burnout and an erosion of trust and anxiety and despair. So my sense is that we are all living with this climate disconnection in our lives, whether it's foregrounded or backgrounded. It's there. It's a part of it. And when we can start naming it, then we can start addressing it. And we need to do that in community. We need to do that in kinship circles. We need to do that with spiritual resources that we draw from our traditions. We need to do that in self-compassion ways, self-compassionate ways. So I'm really anxious for the rest of this presentation to speak to addressing moral suffering, because I'm just seeing it writ large.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's one of the things I so love about the BTS Center is it feels like you are providing so many spaces where people can recognize just what you're saying, that this is not just me, and also that the healing and the kind of moving through it um, doesn't need to be something I hold alone, because it is something that we are collectively carrying and collectively grappling with. And so I just am deeply appreciative of all the ways that the BTS Center offers opportunities to process together and to grieve together and to resource together, because that feels increasingly needed. So, and we'll get more to that, but really want to express my gratitude for the work you all do.
Yeah.
So, moral resilience. Um, This is a definition from Cinda Rushton: the capacity of an individual to sustain or restore their integrity in response to moral complexity, confusion, distress, or setbacks. So, this notion of moral resilience is really about how we respond to moral suffering or adversity. And the good news is, it is possible to develop our capacity to respond in healthy ways so that we're not stuck in despair, burnout, and all of those pieces. And this is where I feel like climate change is sort of this different animal, because one of the challenges of fostering moral resilience in the context of climate change is that the actions we might take in any given moment to restore integrity may or may not have much impact on long-term outcomes. So, you know, which is different than, say, when something happens in a war or in a healthcare setting where maybe there can be a resolution that's somewhat near-term future. In the context of climate change, that's not going to be the case necessarily. So it's important, I think, to reflect on this, that moral resilience in this context isn't necessarily about some neat resolution or having a certain outcome, and it's definitely not something that we just do kind of one and done in a workshop. Like, it's really a capacity that we need to continue to foster over time, because
Mhm.
that moral complexity and the uncertainty of climate change is not going away. It's only going to become more fraught, in my opinion, as we go forward.
So you're really talking about practices that can sustain us to respond over and over and over again. The analogy that's coming to my mind, Liz, is that this is not like an acute injury or illness that you might encounter as a healthcare chaplain. It's like a chronic disease that needs to continuously be tended to. And so we have to keep finding new creative energies and practices to apply so that we can do this over essentially our lifetimes and the lifetimes of those who come after us too.
Exactly, exactly. It's really about developing a certain orientation to how we meet these challenges and how we meet our work in this time. So I'll say a little more about kind of what do we mean then by moral resilience. And I want to I want to actually share a little bit of the research around it, both kind of describing what it is and also then getting to this part about how we develop it. So this slide right here, um, one angle for thinking about this is looking at the attributes of people who the research would describe as morally resilient. These qualities came from a content analysis in the healthcare literature. And we did cover these in the webinar that you and I did earlier this year with Rita Brock, which I know we're going to give folks the link to that at the end of this if they want to hear more. So I'll just go through these fairly quickly. Um, the hallmark of morally resilient people is a strong sense of integrity, or really more specifically, the capacity to sustain or return to integrity in response to moral adversity. So, again, it's that piece about how do we respond when moral adversity arises. And that might manifest as making changes in response to a harm, taking action in some way. There's many different ways we can think about what that looks like to come back into integrity. And I guess the thing I want to point out here is that what I love about this framing is that it makes it clear that moral suffering itself is not the problem, so to speak. It's not a flaw in because in a sense, its presence, it's very our awareness of it in our experience is actually a catalyst that helps us realize, oh, I'm out of alignment with my moral compass. So then I can kind of right myself. So I think of it as almost like a mindfulness bell. Hopefully not at the extreme end of the spectrum with like moral injury in its more extreme forms, but that if I feel moral discomfort or moral distress, that's like a mindfulness bell that says, oh, there's something that I need to do here to come back into alignment, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah. Beautiful, beautifully said.
So capacity to return to integrity is the first and most important piece. And then buoyancy is really about the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. So, for example, someone with this quality, rather than despairing or really falling into a sense of helplessness when moral adversity arises, might ask some questions like, how could I learn from this? What action might I take to address this or do this differently? And I want to be clear, it's not about bypassing or um, not acknowledging when there are challenges or setbacks, but just that we're able to kind of find our balance or this sense of buoyancy and continue on in the work. And a related quality is moral efficacy, which is basically the belief that we can do something about the moral dilemmas we face. So again, not feeling helpless in the face of these challenges and learning that we have agency, even if that's in kind of small micro ways. The fourth thing here is self-regulation, which is really the ability to regulate or influence our emotions and thoughts, and being able to bring a certain level of equanimity to our emotional experience, to bring some compassion and openness and space to our emotional experience. So kind of riding the waves of challenges. And then the last thing I have here is self-stewardship. Um, and that refers to the attitudes and behaviors we take to maintain health and well-being. So people who are morally resilient tend to have a variety of ways that they take care of their health and well-being. And one thing I like to say about this piece too is that it's also about having good boundaries. And
Mm.
and that could look a lot of different ways, but one example that I've heard a lot of people speaking recently about paying closer attention to how much news they're consuming and when, and being very intentional about that, so the nervous system isn't just flooded with a sense of despair. So that can be a form of self-stewardship, not ignoring the world, of course, but titrating. And the same goes with like how we are engaging with others. Having a clear sense of what's my nervous system, what's somebody else's nervous systems. I've heard so many stories in recent weeks of people in work settings where uh, there's just a lot of dysregulation and things coming out sideways and a lot of fear kind of in the aftermath of this recent election. And so being able to take care of oneself and be the nervous system that is regulated and calm in the midst of all of that is a really important piece here.
I'm really struck in this list how many times and how many ways you've invoked agency, self-agency, that there's a lot of choice in here. Um, decisions that are prompted by that sense of being out of alignment, that signal, the mindfulness bell, as you mentioned, but then all the different ways in which we can sort of walk our way back. Maybe we can't change the whole system, but I mean, my belief is every time we change ourselves, we're changing the system in ways that we may or may not be aware of. So every time we take a closer step to being in integrity, every time we take a closer step to being self-regulated, the system has to respond to that, right?
I believe that's the case. I really do, and I think that's a big emphasis in Upaya's chaplaincy training too. We talk a lot about systems and how to be that leverage point in the system at any given moment that can help to move toward change. So, yeah, absolutely. Next slide here is just, again, this is a list of related qualities that support moral resilience, taken from that same healthcare literature. And so these are things like courage, empathy, compassion, humility, mindfulness, and self-awareness. And I love this list. These are qualities I imagine that many people in the BTS audience or those who are listening to this would probably recognize in themselves, at least some of these. And so that means to me that we all have the seeds of moral resilience in us. And so then how do we water those seeds? How do we cultivate these qualities in ourselves, especially when in times where there's difficulty, where we feel um, kind of crisis in front of us?
Yeah, I'm recognizing so many of these, Liz, from the teachings of our world's faith traditions, um, that this is this is basically the tenets of so many religious traditions right here. And so for us to be able to step back into our homes, our religious and spiritual homes, and come from there means that we could also be cultivating moral resilience by standing in that space, in that place, and with our spiritual ancestors alongside us.
Absolutely. Don't you love that when research shows that, something that maybe we've already known in a anecdotal or intuitive way, it turns out to be borne out through a more cognitive analysis. It's always interesting to me when that happens. So,
I love it.
okay, so we're almost to the end here, and you know, the question, of course, arises, okay, so how do we develop moral resilience, beyond understanding there's these qualities that support it? And again, I've shared some of these in the other webinar, so I'll go through them briefly. But the first one, and we've been talking about this in different ways throughout our conversation, is reflecting on values. And as we spoke about at the beginning of this conversation, this notion of the moral orienting system being something we're not necessarily consciously aware of a lot of the time. So the idea here is that when we do intentionally reflect on our values in a regular way, it can actually help us to embody them in our work and our lives in a more proactive way. So for example, in the Upaya chaplaincy program, students spend a lot of time studying Buddhist precepts, which is in part to really concretize the importance of being grounded in an ethical framework, especially for people who are going to be serving in situations where there is a lot of suffering, and that
Mhm,
includes, of course, moral suffering.
mhm,
So this idea of reflecting on our values and bringing the moral orienting system into our conscious awareness is is one thing we can do. It might just be pausing once a day or once a week to think, why am I really doing this work?
mhm,
What's
mhm,
most
mhm.
important to me? And talking to colleagues about that too, which is the peer support piece I'm going to go to in a minute. And actually, before I go to the peer support, I hope this isn't too far afield, but I just want to say one more thing briefly that I learned actually just a couple of weeks ago in uh, the most recent chaplaincy training that we had at Upaya. We had this wonderful researcher from UC Berkeley, Dr. Keltner, teaching. I think I might have shared a little bit about this with you um, offline, Allison. So Dr. Keltner teaches about the science of awe, and he has a really wonderful book that came out last year where he talks about awe as this really vital emotion to cultivate in difficult times. And he shared all the science. Again, it's like one of those things where science proves out something maybe we already know, but science around how awe supports stronger community connections and stronger connections with the natural world, and helps us feel more generous and all these beautiful things. And the connection to this conversation is that one of the primary ways he's identified to foster awe is through sharing stories of moral beauty.
Oh my, yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, I just found that so beautiful. So moral beauty, as he defines it, is anything that moves us to act or to change, inspired by someone else's courage or humility, or their moral capacity, basically. So yeah, maybe I'm making the leap here. My sense is that the more we can not just individually reflect on our values, but share and kind of inspire each other through these stories of moral beauty, the more we also collectively strengthen our moral resilience. So I just felt like I wanted to throw that in. You can edit it out if it feels too far out.
Not at all, not at all.
So, anyway, reflecting on values, moral beauty, and then seeking out peer support is another way to foster moral resilience. I know we've been talking about this one uh, throughout this conversation as well, but it's so important because I think we need each other for this engagement with moral suffering and to grieve together and to feel into how do we respond to this? And I think for me in my own life, peers have just been a very helpful mirror sometimes when I've experienced a moral dilemma and needed feedback or just wanted kind of validation of like, oh yeah, that is a really difficult situation, and kind of sitting with it together. So being willing to ask for support, being willing to talk with colleagues about this moral suffering when it comes up. And again, I can't say enough about the programs you all have at the BTS Center as serving this function as a connector of peers. This content.
Exactly, exactly.
Cultivating an open mindset. This is, feels related again to that research on awe, but really this is about um, keeping an open mind in morally complex situations, because that allows us to engage qualities like curiosity and humility. Again, these are some of the qualities we were mentioning before. Um, when we come with an open mind, we tend to be more open to different perspectives, we ask better questions. And so this one is really about having the kind of flexibility and ability to adapt to change that I feel like is just necessary. We think about the complexity and the uncertainty that climate change brings. Um, so having that open mindset and not being kind of rigid and narrow. Then this is, yeah, these are all feel kind of woven together, but move beyond binary thinking. Uh, I want to say a little bit more about this one because this is one that I actually didn't speak about with Rita, but feels important, especially for the BTS audience, because I think so often moral or ethical behavior is seen in a binary, kind of black and white, right or wrong perspective. And this binary thinking for many of us is deeply ingrained culturally, and without hopefully opening too big a can of worms, I would say that it stems partly from the legacy of some of our spiritual traditions.
Yes, yeah,
um, so the
yeah,
issue with binary thinking is that, by definition, it wants there to be kind of neat categories. It doesn't leave room for a lot of complexity or nuance or bringing one's imagination or kind of thinking in out of the box ways. And one example that I often give in talking about this in relation to climate change is related to Joanna Macy's work from
mhm,
Active Hope, which I imagine many people in the BTS community know about. But she just very briefly, she outlines these two dominant narratives, which are binary narratives about climate change. And one she defines as business as usual, which is sort of, the emphasizing economic growth as the most important value, and um, like willful ignorance about living on a planet of finite resources, but essentially projecting this idea that everything's okay, climate change isn't that big of a deal, business as usual. And the other narrative, the kind of the other end of the spectrum, she calls the great unraveling, which is the idea that it's really too late. We're all doomed. There's nothing we can do about the trajectory we're on. And so it creates this binary of either everything's fine or nothing's fine, we're doomed. And if I think about it in myself, if I'm honest, I tend to toggle between those two places a lot of the time. Um, and the scary thing is, or the thing that feels important to mention about this in this context, is that um, both of those narratives are immobilizing because they are both kind of different flavors of moral apathy, right? One is like, everything's fine, so I don't need to do anything, kind of the willful ignorance flavor of moral apathy. And the other one is sort of a nihilism, like nothing I do matters, so why bother? And so I share this just to show how binary thinking is not helpful usually with something as complex as what we're facing. And so allowing ourselves to be in the messiness of not knowing um, enables what Joanna Macy refers to as the great turning, kind of leaning into this third narrative that suggests that even though, of course, we can't know or guarantee what's going to happen, we can still act in integrity and we can still be responsive to what's unfolding in this emergent way. And that to do that, we need a certain moral sensitivity and moral discernment so that we can feel our way, because things will change. We might come up with something this year that then by 5 years from now doesn't make sense anymore. And so being able to really evolve and be creative and get out of that binary way of approaching things is really important.
Oh, beautifully said. Just really beautifully said. I want you to keep going, but I just want to acknowledge that was just a gorgeous, gorgeous example of binary thinking and the limitations, the not just limitations, but the traps that it sets up for us. Yeah,
Yeah.
cute.
So, oh, you're welcome. I'm grateful to talk about this with you. And this last piece is engaging in self-stewardship, kind of calling back to that previous slide of self-stewardship being one of the qualities of morally resilient people. I I highlight it here again because it is so important, especially for chaplains. This idea that we need to care for our own well-being in order to turn toward the suffering of others and turn toward the suffering of the climate crisis in a skillful way. And uh, this might involve grief work, it might involve contemplative practices, being in nature, what I mentioned before about, maybe titrating our news intake. This could be many different things, but the idea is just, yeah, we need to care for our own nervous systems and our own selves in order to serve sustainably. So,
Well, you've given so much just at this one slide, and I know you've mentioned the work of the BTS Center throughout this presentation, and in this slide, I'm really seeing the BTS Center's a footprint in some ways. But yes, I'm thinking particularly of your comments about imagination and the the spaces that we need to steward in order to cultivate imagination and nurture it, because it's something that a lot of people would say we don't have time for, or it's not the right time for. And it's exactly there and then that we need to open up some spaciousness for our creativity to emerge, for us to cultivate the open mindset, yes, but also to reflect on our values in such a way that we might find common cause with people who actually do hold values similar to those that we don't, to us, and that we don't actually imagine will share values. Maybe we have other identity differences, but we can find the common ground around values. So
yeah,
this is such an incredibly rich slide. Each one of these points that you have made call to mind either a BTS center posture or program or practice that we've been inviting people into to hold the space with our constituents, not just for them, but with them, so that some of this work can be done and in a supportive and kind way, which is, I think, what many of us are longing for right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we just have one or two more slides here to close. We wanted to leave a couple of questions that hopefully are helpful as prompts, at least in part, in this reflecting on values piece. And the first one here is from Pat McCabe, who is a DNA activist and writer who has been involved in some of the high-level climate talks in recent years. She also has taught in the Upaya chaplaincy program, which is how I first came across her work. And when she teaches, she often asks a version of this question, which I just love. How do I be that human being whose presence causes all other life to thrive? And to me, I'm a Zen practitioner. This to me feels like a Zen koan. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, what would this look like? How do I be that human being whose presence causes all other life to thrive?
Mm. That's just, yeah, boy, we could sit with that question for a long time. And I'm appreciating Liz, including Margaret Wheatley here with this question, who do we choose to be? Margaret Wheatley, Meg Wheatley, has been a good friend to the BTS Center, and we have read books together, and featured her in one of our speaker online events. And Meg tells it the way that she sees it, and she sees some very very dark real times that we are entering into, that we're in the midst of, and offers this question as something that we continue to come back to. Who do we choose to be? There's that agency again. And that who is a who that has integrity, the who that addresses suffering in others, the who that, as Joanna Macy says, the who that will turn towards another rather than on or against another.
Mm.
So we are deeply invested in this question too.
I love that so much. So our last slide just has these couple of resources. I wanted to be sure to highlight the two books that much of the research that I shared and the framing that I shared today come from. So Joan Halifax's book, Standing at the Edge, and Cinda Rushton's book on moral resilience. And I just highly recommend both of those for anyone who's interested in diving deeper into these topics. And then I think we also have the video of the webinar that you invited Rita Brock and I to do together earlier this year on moral injury from climate change as it relates to chaplains. And it's a little bit overlapping, but we tried to keep it pretty distinct what we shared today. So hopefully folks could get something out of that resource as well.
I'm sure that they can. And Liz, the only thing that is left at this point is to say thank you. Thank you so much for taking on this particular kind of work, not only in your own work, but in the work with the communities that you interact with, through Upaya, through the BTS Center, through the Spiritual Care Services of Maine. We are so grateful to have you as a partner, as somebody in our ecosystem that we can continue to turn to and learn from. And yeah, you are an amazing partner. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, well, likewise, Allison, I just feel incredibly grateful to be invited into the BTS circle and to be able to contribute to these conversations. And we need each other, we in the biggest sense. So I feel like the more collegiality, the more mutual support that we can offer, the better. This really, to me, feels like just an integral part of what it means to be a chaplain, what it means to be in a space where we're trying to offer some wisdom and compassion for folks about how to meet this moment. So thank you for the invitation. It's been a real pleasure.
And thanks for all of you who have joined us in viewing this recording. We always love to hear your feedback. If there are topics that you would like us to address, things that you'd like us to know about going on in the world, please feel free to be in touch with us at info@thebtscenter.org. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Bye.